Atop the same cliff in Normandy where Army Rangers fought against the Nazis on D-Day, President Biden today asked Americans to defend democracy in our time. The major speech comes as Biden is seeking to tell voters at home that democracy is on the ballot in November. NTD's Washington correspondent Iris Tao has more from Normandy.
And President Biden on Friday gave a speech about freedom and democracy right here at Pointe du Hoc in Normandy, where President Ronald Reagan gave one of his most famous speeches 40 years ago about the Cold War. This is an 100-foot tall cliff where Army Rangers 80 years ago on D-Day scaled under heavy gunfire to successfully seize German positions. Biden today praised the bravery of these Rangers and also used this to call on Americans to fulfill their duty of protecting democracy.
They're not asking us to scale these cliffs. They're asking us to do our job, to protect freedom in our time, to defend democracy.
Biden is trying to target audiences at home in the U.S. While he did not mention Trump by name, he called on Americans to protect the freedoms of our time and stand up to aggression both abroad and at home. Meanwhile, Biden also used the occasion to call for more support for Ukraine, stressing the need to stand up to Putin.
They stood against Hitler's aggression. Does anyone doubt that they would want America to stand up against Putin's aggression here in Europe today?
Earlier on Friday, Biden met with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy in Paris, where he announced another over $200 million in Ukraine aid and apologized that it took so long.
I apologize for those weeks of not knowing what's going to happen in terms of funding. I assure you, the United States is going to stand with you.
And during a state visit to France this weekend, Biden will talk more about the future of Ukraine with French President Emmanuel Macron. And next week, Biden will head to Italy for the G7 summit, where leaders will talk about using frozen Russian assets to send more aid to Ukraine. Reporting from Normandy, France, Iris Tao, NTD News.
A date has been set for Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's anticipated address to Congress. The address is showcasing tensions within the Democratic Party, with lawmakers divided over Israel's approach to the war in Gaza. Our Washington correspondent Luis Martinez has the story.
July 24th has been confirmed as the date that Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister, will address a joint session of Congress. The invitation was orchestrated by Speaker of the House Mike Johnson, and it has created tensions among Democrats like Senator Bernie Sanders, who has already announced he will not be attending, or like Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who is still on the fence about it.
I don't think that it is productive right now whatsoever for Netanyahu to be addressing Congress. I'm figuring it out, but I certainly do not approve of it. Potentially may not attend.
Other House Democrats like Representative Jared Moskowitz from Florida disagree with international criticism against the Israeli government, in particular against the International Criminal Court's decision to seek arrest warrants against Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Israeli Defense Minister.
The ICC thing is outrageous, okay? They have no jurisdiction over Israel. The reason why the last couple of months, the reason why the Israelis are in Rafah right now is because Hamas has refused to agree to a ceasefire in release for the hostages.
The House of Representatives passed this week a legislation that will sanction the International Criminal Court for seeking arrest warrants against Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Israeli Defense Minister. 44 Democrats voted with Republicans to pass this bill.
Failing to act here in the Congress would make us complicit with the ICC's illegitimate actions. We must not stay silent, and we must stand with our allies.
The July 24th address will be the fourth time Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu addresses a joint session of Congress, becoming the only head of state to have done it that many times and breaking a tie with former Prime Minister Winston Churchill, who addressed the joint session of the U.S. Congress 3 times. Last time Benjamin Netanyahu addressed the U.S. Congress was in 2015, and over 50 Democrats boycotted that speech. Reporting from Washington, D.C., Luis Eduardo Martinez, NTD News.
How will members of Congress receive Netanyahu's speech, and what are the implications of Biden's announcement of more aid to Ukraine, while he's also in Europe the day after D-Day? Joining me now to assess these developments is John Sidelides, Senior Fellow at the National Security Program at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. John Sidelides, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
So what's included in this $225 million aid package that the Biden administration just announced that it's sending to Ukraine, and will it be enough to help Ukraine?
Well, there's a very important distinction in terms of what is in the package and what a number of the president's critics have called for. They would like for the United States and for the NATO alliance to provide far more of the longer range ATACMS type missiles that are able to strike deep into Russian territory, perhaps hit Russia's supply lines and oil depots. And what the president has done here is kind of a balance between providing Ukraine greater ability to strike inside of Russian territory, but within a very limited sphere, so that only those areas that are most important for the Russian offensive against Kharkiv and other areas in eastern Ukraine can be hit, but not to strike deep into Russian territory. In other words, to be very careful to move forward on the escalation ladder, giving Ukraine more firepower, more defensive capability, but not in any way that forces Russia's hand so that it then in turn escalates against Ukraine and against Ukraine's supporters.
Talk to me now about the significance of announcing this military package during the anniversary of D-Day in front of our European allies.
Yeah, it's very difficult to read the president's mind on this, but I think certainly there's a sense that there may be a breaking of the cohesion that we've seen to date in the NATO alliance for the better part of the last 2.5 years. With the Euro parliamentary elections coming up in several days, we're going to see a significant push, I think, to the center-right parties, but that's based mostly on issues such as illegal migration, on climate policies, and a whole host of issues that may not have to do so much with Ukraine, but there is a greater debate among European capitals about whether or not there's a viable exit strategy for Ukraine. And ultimately, as the country is being destroyed, who is going to pay for the reconstruction of Ukraine, which right now is being estimated to cost anywhere from $500 billion to $1 trillion inside of a European Union that is essentially deindustrializing before our very eyes because of a number of failed policies regarding energy, dependence on Russia, and now dependence on China to power their economies.
All right, now I want to switch gears here. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu will address Congress next month. This will make him the first world leader to do so 4 times. He's currently tied with Winston Churchill. What message do you expect to hear?
I think if I had to predict that Prime Minister Netanyahu will try to emphasize 2 major points here. One is that Israel has no choice but to take the military means necessary to destroy Hamas's military capabilities to the greatest extent possible. Now, no one believes that they're going to be able to do so 100% anytime in the near future, but essentially to prevent any type of atrocities of the magnitude of October 7th from ever taking place against Israeli civilians for the foreseeable future. But I think it has to be very important here to mention that this is tied to a larger strategy. This is really not about Israel and Hamas. Hamas is a proxy militia for the Iranian regime. And I think what Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu will intend to do here, especially with the Congress, but also far more broadly to the American people, remember, this is going to be sandwiched between the Republican and the Democratic Party conventions in mid-July and late August of this summer, that Iran is the genuine menace to Middle East peace, to stability, and to American interests, assets, bases, and our allies in the Middle East. So it's going to be a 2-pronged speech, I believe. Support Israel to do what it must to extinguish Hamas's military capabilities, but let's make sure Iran does not achieve a nuclear weapons capability. That is something that I think we're losing focus on because we're so concentrated on the war in Gaza.
How would you gauge the reaction from members of Congress about it?
Well, it seems to date that most Republicans remain strongly supportive of Israel's efforts to, again, destroy Hamas's military capabilities. You do have an increasing non-interventionist wing inside the Republican Party that is more concerned not so much about what is happening between Israel and Hamas, but placing it in the larger context of an ongoing war with no clear exit strategy between Russia and Ukraine, and of course the need to remain focused on the strategic threat to American security, and that's the Chinese Communist Party, against Taiwan, against Japan, against all of the ASEAN countries in the South China Sea. So we have to place what's happening in the Middle East in a broader international context. The real interest is going to be in what's happening in the Democratic Party, because the president seems to be trying to have it both ways, standing by Israel as a longtime American ally in the Middle East, but also placating a very vocal, very vehement wing of the Democratic Party that seems to actually loathe Israel and perhaps even the Jewish people for the sake of the Palestinian cause. And unfortunately, here we see Palestinian civilians being sacrificed by Hamas deliberately as cannon fodder in order to try to humiliate Israel in American eyes and before international eyes.
Do you see that Netanyahu's address will soften any tensions between U.S. and Israel?
I don't know. That's going to be a great question. We'll have to see what kind of a speech Netanyahu gives, what takes place between now and July 24th, and also what's going to be the domestic politics regarding Netanyahu's speech. We don't know how disrupted the speech is going to be. We don't know what will be happening in Washington with pro-Hamas or pro-Palestinian supporters. I think we'll have to look to see what the Netanyahu speech looks like, and of course, what are the conditions in the war between Israel and Hamas over the next 4 to 5 weeks.
John Sidolides, thank you very much for your time here today.
Thanks for having me.
Coming up, Vice President Kamala Harris touting support for a Senate candidate from Maryland. That's while former President Trump's endorsement in Virginia draws concerns from his fellow Republicans.
Thank you for watching the Capitol Report. If you want to see our full broadcast, check us out at epochtv.com.